Your government is corrupt, oppressive, and possibly evil. But despite all of it, you should still obey your government because you need it. The only reason the government exists in the first place is because you're too stupid to exist without one. And that's universal. Humans need government to function. There's never been a successful civilization without a government. Not one. Sorry, libertarians, it just hasn't happened. And if you believe Thomas Hobbes, we should obey our government because without it, we would exist in the absolute state of nature. A Darwinian nightmare where survival of the fittest is the only law of the land. Eat or be eaten, kill or be killed, dominate or be dominated. We would have nothing. Quote, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society. And which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Our government, as corrupt as it may be, is stopping that from becoming a reality. Maybe we should be thankful. Maybe government really is bringing good. But how many atrocities have to happen before you can't look the other way anymore? How many famines have to decimate your people before you wonder, maybe the state of nature won't be so bad? The answer differs from person to person, but the most notable example of a people reaching their breaking point is the Russian Revolution of 1917. It changed everything. And at the center of it all was Leon Trotsky. Someone you could spend a lifetime studying and still find it difficult to understand him. He was the kind of guy who had the pragmatism of a veteran politician, but the idealism of a college student hoping to change the world. Someone who wouldn't hesitate to throw himself into the center of the bureaucracy to make things happen. But someone who also didn't mind to take a few years off to write a book idealizing the revolution. Hunter and hunted, farm boy and cosmopolitan, comrade and enemy, victor and victim. This is the life of Leon Trotsky. Hello friends, my name is Michael McCauley. You are listening to Biocast. What's our goal here? Understanding history, one person at a time. Before we get into the episode, I want you to know that if you really like it, you can get even more. There's always a lot of great information that couldn't make it into the episode, so I bundle all that up and sell it for the price of a cup of coffee. Or you can get it by joining the Biocast bonus member community over on Patreon. Links to everything will be in the show notes. Thank you so much for tuning in. Now let's get into the show. Ever since the Babylonian Exile, the Jews have been in a difficult position. They've basically been in this constant state of migration. They move somewhere new, integrate into the local culture, get just a little bit too much influence in this new society, and get forced out, where they have to repeat the whole process over again. It was really rough. And so what would happen is they eventually stopped trying to integrate into these cultures. They only did so hesitantly, just enough to get by. But most importantly, they retained their Jewish identity, which eventually became a defining feature in comparison to just about every other people group on Earth. Why bother to learn the local language and customs if, by the time your son is an adult, they tell your entire ethno group to get out of the country? But different Jewish communities tackled this dilemma in their own ways. Some of them did try to assimilate. Some of them took any opportunity they could get. One of those opportunities happened when Tsar Alexander I decided to create a settlement of agriculture for the Jewish population near the Black Sea in modern Ukraine. A Jewish family by the name of Bronstein was one of the first takers to settle in this region. Today this town is known as Berislavka, but back then the people called it Yanovka. Yanovka would be the birthplace and hometown of Lev Davidovich Bronstein. The name Trotsky was born with, a name that he eventually abandoned in favor of his communist pseudonym. However, for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to refer to him as Trotsky for the rest of the episode. It just makes it a little bit easier on both of us. If you read his autobiography, you'll see that he really tries to portray his childhood as working class, even a bit impoverished. But many historical sources note his family for being one of the wealthiest in the village, and considering that he would become a communist revolutionary, he really wanted to go out of his way to hide anything that could be used against him, like coming from a wealthy family. Trotsky was one of the leaders in promoting the whole "let's kill the kulaks" or rich people. And oh, what do you know, wouldn't it be funny if Leon Trotsky turned out to be a kulak himself? Regardless of how much money they had, these early years in this small, rural village would prove very significant in shaping Trotsky's ideals. One of the workers on his father's farm helped shape his ideal of what a hard worker should look like. Quote, "He would smoke and look into the distance, perhaps pondering about something or remembering something or simply relaxing without a thought in his head. At such times, I used to sidle up to him and affectionately twirl his bushy auburn mustache around my fingers, or examine his hands, those remarkable, absolutely special hands of a master craftsman. All the skin of his hands was covered with little black spots. These were the tiny splinters that had irremovably penetrated his body when he was cutting millstones. His fingers were as tenacious as roots, but not completely hard. They broadened towards the tips and were very supple, and he could turn his thumb right back so as to form an arch. Each of his fingers was conscious, living, and acting by itself. Together, they formed an unusual working collective. However young I was, I could already see and feel that this hand was not like other hands when holding a hammer or a pair of pliers. There was a deep scar around his left thumb. Ivan Vasilovich had caught his hand with an axe the day I was born, and the thumb was hanging almost by the skin alone. My father had happened to see the young mechanic laying his hand on a board and getting ready to chop off his thumb altogether. "Stop!" he had shouted. "Your finger will grow back again." "It will grow back, you think?" asked the mechanic, and put the axe aside. The thumb really did grow back and worked well. Ivan Vasilovich didn't complain or shirk his responsibilities. He did what needed to be done. And for some reason or another, this left a very strong impression on the young Leon Trotsky. And there's another really telling young experience that you need a little bit of context for. You see, these small rural villages were severely lacking in law enforcement. Russia was particularly lawless in comparison to its Western neighbors. These small villages relied on integrity. But when integrity didn't work, vigilante justice took its place. There were countless experiences of people being severely punished or beaten or tortured for crimes that they probably didn't even commit. It was a particularly brutal way of justice, but I suppose it was better than nothing. At least the people that did this kind of stuff thought so. On this one occasion, a peasant's cow wandered onto the family farm and had eaten a few dollars worth of grain. David Bronstein, Trotsky's dad, was livid. David was screaming at this guy. He would not let up. He was really mad about this. Seeing his father in such a state of rage at a peasant sent Trotsky into tears. Quote, "The croquet-playing mood I had brought from the pitch amid the pear trees where I had trounced my sisters immediately gave way to acute despair. I slipped past my father, rushed into my bedroom, fell flat on the bed, and cried myself into oblivion despite the fact that I was a pupil in the 2nd grade at school." The Bronsteins tried comforting their son, but he couldn't stop, couldn't even answer them. He just sat there and cried into his pillow. This was something he felt on a very personal level. Another thing that's really important to note about Trotsky's upbringing is that he wasn't just raised in a Jewish home, but he was raised in a secular Jewish home. They were technically Jewish, but it's not like they went out of their way to practice Jewish traditions or anything. It's not like it had a lasting impression on Trotsky growing up. His household was secular, and it produced a very secular person. But the Bronsteins noticed something early on about their son. He wasn't like other boys. He thought differently. His brain was wired unlike most people around him. He was extremely smart. And David did not want his son growing up with the same educational disadvantage he had. David never went to school, and he literally had to rely on Trotsky to keep his business records for him because he wasn't educated enough to do it himself. The guy was a hop and a skip away from straight up illiteracy. But he saw a lot of potential in his son. So, when Trotsky was 8 years old, he was sent off to be educated in one of the most booming metropolitan cities in Europe, Odessa. And in this city, the young Trotsky would be exposed to cultures from across the continent. People spoke French there, for heaven's sake. They discussed the biggest ideas of the time. Lenin published a newspaper there nearly 20 years before the revolution. So you can understand the influence a city like that would have on a young Trotsky, something that was noted in one of his earliest biographies. And before we get too into the nitty-gritty of his political career, I feel it's really important to get a good understanding of the political situation in Russia during this time. You see, Russia was the name, instability was the game, and one of the major reasons for all of this instability was that the vast majority of people were absolute peasants with no power. There were two ruling classes, the unelected autocrats running the government and the landowners. All of the wealth that Russia produced went to those two classes of people. Once in a while, you could find an emancipated peasant who somehow found success on a farm or starting a business, but they were extremely rare. In America, in 2019, about 95% of all new businesses fail. With all of our wealth and opportunity and consumerism and everything else, 95% still fail. Think about how much more difficult it is to start a successful business in Russia in 1898 with this regressive ruling government, a population who can't afford much of anything anyway, and dozens of other factors working against you, like insane laws and taxes, and there's so many obstacles to becoming financially independent. It was damn near impossible. Starting your own business is off the table for all practical purposes for most people. So, where does that leave you as a peasant? Tied to land you don't own. Feudalism. The rest of Europe was moving into the 20th century, but Russia really lagged behind. It was bad. From about 1870 until the Russian Revolution, none of the czars or the ruling class really worried too much about liberating the peasants. It just wasn't their problem. They didn't care, and the Russian peasants really felt this. This is going to be one of the number of things that are really going to set the groundworks for revolution. It's one thing to know that your ruling class doesn't care about you, but when they're actively keeping you where you are, down in the dirt, in poverty, starving, your kids are dying and sick, horrible living conditions, when they are keeping you there, it is a whole new level of outrage. By actively working against the interests of your own people, you are making them your enemy. So let's not forget, the revolutionary attitude in Russia was not because of some brilliant Marxist propagandists or people finally being fed up. It was because the ruling class in Russia was so horrible. Another thing working against Russia is this other political trend sweeping across Europe: nationalism. People didn't want to live in some random country with arbitrary borders and a lack of coherence. Because, well, in most of these countries, that's exactly what you have. Look at Austria-Hungary. Two completely different people groups with a different language and culture and everything else. When things get bad, they start turning on each other. It's just natural. That's what happens when you have different people living under one government. Nothing really unifies them. When things are good, everyone gets along just fine, but all of a sudden there's a war, and one side doesn't contribute as much as the other, or at least that's the common perception, you can often find yourself on the brink of a civil war. And you see, Russia is in a particularly difficult situation because most of the people in Russia aren't even Russian. The estimates vary, but about 44% of the Russian Empire is composed of ethnic and cultural Russians. Do you see a problem there? That's not even half. Not even half of the country is Russian. So, who are these other people living in the Russian Empire? Well, it's not that hard to figure out. Basically, all of the countries bordering Russia today. This includes Ukraine, Poland, Belarus. There was a sizable Jewish minority, as well as Muslims in the southern regions. And it gets really tricky for the Tsar when some of these nationalities start fighting to become an independent nation state. Poland posed a great threat, especially because just earlier that century, Napoleon gave them their own country. Only lasted a little while, but having a taste of independence can be very motivating. People never forgot about that. The next independence movement they had to worry about was Ukraine. Not only did Ukraine speak a different language and have a different culture, but they were also the hub of economic activity in the Russian Empire. The Ukrainians were tired of having all their wealth taxed and sent over to Moscow for some autocrat to reap the reward. And you see, the situation with the Ukrainians was tough because Russia could repress and censor the Ukrainian nationalists within their own borders, but they only had about 1/3 of all ethnic Ukrainians within Russian borders. There was a sizable minority in Austria, another third of the Ukrainians lived over there, and they had the benefit of Western liberalism and not absolute, but reasonable freedom of speech. At least free enough speech that they could be nationalists in Austria. So the Ukrainians in Austria are drumming up support for Ukrainian independence, and then some of that is going to spill over to the Ukrainians living in Russia. This is going to be one of those things driving a wedge between Russia and Austria going forward, and it creates a lot of tension. Enough to contribute to World War I, because in response to Austria not censoring these Ukrainian nationalists, Russia is going to support Serbian nationalism that's happening in Austrian territory. So Russia basically says, if you support nationalists trying to gain independence in our nation, we're going to support nationalists trying to gain independence in your nation and see how you like it. I'm sure you're familiar with the story of Gavrilo Princip assassinating the Archduke Ferdinand, the event that caused World War I. Yeah, Gavrilo Princip was a Serbian nationalist who had the support of Russia behind him. And you see, Russian propaganda was really good because they were framing it like, well, these guys are our fellow Slavic Orthodox Christian brothers, so of course they have our support for independence. Why should they have to be subjugated by some Catholic Germans? I think you can see why the Tsarist regime was as unpopular as it was. It was very regressive, backward, hypocritical, and they pulled stuff like this all the time. Like, this isn't something new for them. This was the norm. Now, another problem that Russia was facing was this vast amount of territory that it controls. More land generally means more money and more power. But here's the caveat, it also means more upkeep. And Russia's backward and regressive government was far from efficient. For example, law enforcement was stretched extremely thin. The Russian provinces had about 9,000 state police officers to govern a population of 100 million. This doesn't count the cities, but remember, not a lot of people even live in those cities. It was just about 100 million people living in the countryside. And to keep the order among them all were 9 11,000 police officers. That puts the police officer to citizen ratio at about 1 to 11,000. Even if you're the best cop in the world, you probably can't maintain order among 11,000 people. It's just crazy to think about. I had to fact check this from a couple different sources because I didn't even believe it the first time I read it, but it's actually true. As unbelievable as it is. To put that into perspective, around the same time, the British had more police officers in rural Ireland. There were literally more British soldiers taking care of rural Ireland than in all of Russia. All of Russia. Given the circumstances, I'm sure you can see why the Russian government was so paranoid about revolutionaries. So whenever these communist or socialist agitators started popping up, the Tsar sent in his secret police to take care of things. The Okhrana. They were notorious, especially amongst Western Europeans. The Okhrana had unlimited power and could arrest you for your political affiliations and basically anything else they wanted. And unlike every other sector of the Russian government, they were extremely good at their jobs. When it came to building infrastructure and providing opportunities for the locals, the Russian government really dropped the ball. But when it came to identifying and targeting and harassing and arresting thought criminals, well, all of a sudden they knew how to get their act together. Funny how that works. But again, you look at how many police officers they had on the ground, and you can kind of understand why they did it. Now, why the Russian government didn't just take the people in the Okhrana and put them into the state police force, why that didn't happen is beyond me, but again, efficiency was not really their top priority. Now, the one thing working in favor of the Russian government was that the economy stayed agrarian for a very long time. That means all of the problems that you have in early capitalism, the problems Western Europe was facing, wouldn't come to Russia for at least a couple decades. Britain and France and Germany are all suffering with child labor and low wages, and everyone being forced to leave their family farm to move to a big city, and what do you know, you can't even afford to live in the city because there are no jobs anymore. There was a lot of uncertainty and chaos, and all that gave way to communist thinkers. This rough transition into a capitalist economy made a lot of people think communism was the only viable option. And let's be honest, folks, some of these people were very smart. We have the benefit of knowing how communism ends up, but the people living during this industrial revolution, they didn't have that. They saw capitalism come in, ruin families, leave people homeless, exploit workers, and create monopolies, and all kinds of other horrible stuff. We should all be very fortunate because we live on the cushy side of capitalism. Communist thinking would take a little bit more time to make way to Russia because you don't need communism if you're a feudal serf. You just don't. It's not necessary. When Russia started industrializing in the 1880s, those communist agitators all of a sudden had an audience. Because you had the misery and the chaos that comes with the early adoption of capitalism, but you also have an authoritarian state with no liberal principles to protect you and your freedom. It was the worst of both worlds. And in the 1890s particularly, Russia would suffer a number of famines that wiped out thousands of people. And it got so bad that someone who didn't even believe in financially helping people devoted time and effort to distributing food during these famines. This was, of course, none other than Leo Tolstoy, who was, by this time, already a successful and wealthy writer. He had a very unique religious perspective and thought simply giving people money was immoral. I'm not going to give you his whole train of thought, but that's what he believed. And even with that belief, he went out to give people food, which many people noted as a contradiction. Believe it or not, his son wrote about Tolstoy not being able to live luxuriously in Moscow anymore, knowing that there were people starving and suffering. Tolstoy is supposed to have written, quote, "There is sin without end, but I cannot stay at home and write. I feel the necessity of taking part in it, of doing something." He spent the next few years of his life away from writing and helping with famine relief because he recognized that if he didn't go out there and do it, nobody else was coming. Just think for a moment how bad a famine has to be that an immensely popular, best-selling author feels morally obligated to put down the pen, stop working, and personally help people who are starving to death. Industrialization was not kind to the Russian peasant. Now, this may have been an absolute disaster for many people, but there was a group of people who benefited. The communists. Exploiting tragedies for a political cause is nothing new today, and it was nothing new then. And boy, did it give them a lot of ammunition, because communism went from some obscure idea that only radicals believed in to something that every average person could really get behind. Trotsky even makes note of how bad this famine is in his autobiography. Quote, "The year 1891, memorable for the crop failure and the famine, marked the official date of the political breaking point in the country. The new decade centered around the labor question. The political shift in the direction of action cropped up first of all in the midst of the intelligentsia. More and more frequently and decisively did the young Marxists resort to action. And at the same time, the dormant populist movement began to show signs of awakening. In 1893, the first legally printed Marxist work written by Struve made its appearance. I was then in my 14th year and still very remote from these matters." But the young Trotsky would not be remote for very long. The next few years of Trotsky's life forged him. He became increasingly distant from his family. After living in Odessa for so many years, his family seemed like an afterthought. They constantly pressed him to pursue mathematics, but he wasn't having it. There was one thing on Trotsky's mind: revolution. And by the time he makes it to early adulthood, he decides to make this the one thing that he does with all of his time and all of his energy. He moved to another city, became involved with a socialist organization. And part of becoming a socialist meant that he had to take up a certain lifestyle. You see, he had been accustomed to upper middle class living. That's how he was raised. It's kind of tough to run in the socialist crowd when you got a silver spoon in your mouth. So he has a falling out with his parents, stops speaking to them altogether for a little while, and starts living in one of these weird socialist group homes. But little did they know, the Okhrana were onto them. And just as they were starting to find some success in the city, things took a turn for the worse. The month was January. Trotsky was enjoying a nice time visiting a comrade who worked for a wealthy landowner. This particular comrade was tasked with holding Trotsky's extra illegal paperwork, and he did so pretty well. He hid this paperwork in a briefcase in a hole in the garden of this wealthy landowner. Surely, no one would look there. It was a brilliant plan that no one was ever going to find out about. Until they did. And right as this comrade went to retrieve the briefcase, which was hidden in a hole next to a tree, the police stormed the property. They came from every which direction, but all was not lost. He managed to hand the briefcase off to a sympathetic housekeeper who tried to hide the briefcase under the snow. They lucked out. The cops didn't find it, at least until the snow melted in the summertime. A different worker came across the briefcase and handed it to the landowner. He turned it into the police. And the handwriting in these documents were damning evidence against Trotsky and his comrades. The year was 1898. Being sent to prison anywhere is going to entail a lot of suffering. Horrible working conditions, small living spaces, food that somehow makes grass more appetizing. These are all things that plagued the prisons of the day. One of the worst parts to prison, though, is the isolation. the inability to spend time with people you care about. If you get any free time at all, it's spent with people you probably don't like. A bunch of prisoners. But Trotsky lucked out because he married one of his fellow comrades, a lovely young lady by the name of Alexandra. They got along just great. Laughed, discussed Marxism. She also just so happened to be Jewish too, so they had a Jewish wedding in prison. The rules just so happened to allow married couples to stay together if they were in prison. So it's kind of like one of those scenarios where you can be stuck and miserable in isolation, but you can only bring one person. Trotsky picked Alexandra. And it turned out pretty good for him because prison was actually a fairly productive period of Trotsky's life. He did have an official falling out with his parents though. They just didn't understand the whole communist revolutionary thing. They probably just thought it was a phase and Trotsky was going to figure things out and become a normal and productive member of society once he served his term. Wrong. Instead of paying his dues in prison, Trotsky paid his attention to books. He became a genius. Every night, every day, he was reading and researching and thinking and arguing and hashing out his ideas, and a lot of the information he had access to wasn't even pro-communist stuff. The first couple of months, he only had legitimate state-enforced propaganda to pick from, but he made the most of it because he identified the best arguments the monarchists and the conservatives could make, and he figured out ways he could outsmart them in debate. Now that's where things matter. He even practiced his debating skills by heckling guards. There was this one police sergeant, McClin, who was a devout Christian. And whenever Trotsky was in the same room with this guy, he would debate theology. Trotsky, a devout atheist. He would say that heaven doesn't exist because, as many descriptions as there are of it, no one could give a physical location. He berated Christians for being so stupid as to investigate the devil who, he believed, didn't exist. I'm sure he made much more arguments than just these two. He went so far as to get 4 different language copies of the Bible and read them intricately just to be able to make good arguments against Christians. He quoted their own book against them. Serving a prison term was the best thing that ever happened to Leon Trotsky. He got to refine his arguments, explore new ideas, got to practice with debating someone. For some of the prisoners, this was unadulterated suffering. But for Trotsky, this was higher education. He got to marry some girl he barely knew and live with her. Got to spend all of his time reading books and making arguments. Sounded like a pretty good time, actually. And just like many college students find out the hard way, Trotsky was about to learn that there are consequences to your actions. His wife was pregnant, and on some level you just gotta be like, well, what do you expect? You put a man and a woman together in a cage who are legally married, and sooner or later there's going to be a third person in there with them. In fact, they'll have 2 kids while in Siberian prison. But this is going to be the point in the story where it's very understandable to feel a little bit of hatred toward Trotsky because he leaves his family behind. He did his best to justify his actions. In his mind, he was going to be the revolutionary messiah that the world needed. He wasn't about to let some children or a family get in the way of his destiny. And then he has the nerve to claim that his wife wanted him to go. It wasn't that Trotsky believed in himself being the revolutionary messiah, but it was his wife, you see, Alexandra. This is what she wanted. I can't even imagine being a woman that says, yeah, I know we just had 2 kids in prison, but like, really, I can do this on my own. Go start the revolution. Me and the kiddies will read about it in the paper. I'm fine. But no, it gets even worse. So, over the course of the next couple years, he at least had the decency to write back to his long-forgotten wife with 2 children. When you start spending time reading those letters back to his family, though, you notice a particular pattern. He doesn't really ask about them. doesn't even seem to care. Now you can go in and read them for free, just Google it or something. The letters that I'd read seemed more like political updates than anything. And there were even times he asked his estranged ex-wife to do his political bidding for him. There was this one time, right? There had been a growing movement of Jewish Marxists, and Trotsky asked Alexandra to go in and disrupt them. Make things easier for the real Marxists, because you see, these other guys, they wanted to speak Yiddish, so they were nationalists, in Trotsky's mind at least. But through and through, the only priority in Trotsky's life was the revolution. Nothing else mattered. Not his wife, not his parents, not his children. After he left Siberia, he managed to land a job at one of the biggest Marxist newspapers in London, Iskra, a Russian word meaning the spark. And what was their motto? From a spark, a fire will flare up. I don't think you could have picked a more poetic or fitting motto if you tried, considering where things go. But it's at this newspaper that he starts getting involved with the big names in Russian communism. Martov, Plekhanov, Vladimir Lenin. These guys are the real who's who of communism. I mean, one of them, Georgy Plekhanov, had been involved with anti-Tsarist political movements going back to the 1870s. And interestingly enough, he was one of the few that really disliked Trotsky. There was a story that went around, and it's not verified or anything, but it's one that so easily could have happened that it may as well have. So, allegedly, there was another columnist that said about Trotsky, "That young man's a genius." And then Plekhanov had replied, "That is something I can't forgive Trotsky." You can really get a sense of jealousy, especially because Trotsky was becoming the new superstar of this Marxist circle. As Robert Service notes in his biography, the old prima donna never wants to make room for the new prima donna. In 1903, something horrible happened for communism. There was an internal ideological split between two sides. The split broke up like this, right? It was between Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and Martov and the Mensheviks. And it's really interesting how this happened, and how this would impact politics in the future. So, the word Bolshevik means majority, and the word Menshevik means minority. But it wasn't a solid majority. There were times when there were more Mensheviks than Bolsheviks and vice versa. The Bolsheviks would eventually become the dominant faction, but that wouldn't come for a very long time. And you might be wondering, what actually was the difference between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks? Well, we could make an entire podcast just on that topic. But if I was going to give you a really simple explanation, it goes something like this. The Bolsheviks had one strategy that they wanted to pursue, a very highly organized, disciplined, revolutionary movement, more like a militia. Lenin, who was basically the figurehead of this faction, argued there would never be a revolution with unorganized support. Sympathy isn't enough. He thought they had to get organized and powerful enough to take out the government, and then they could worry about bringing more people into communism. The Mensheviks took a completely different stance. They wanted every single person on earth who was willing to listen to become a communist or to become as much of a sympathizer as you can get them to be. They didn't necessarily want to overthrow the government if they could do it legally and get, like some kind of state parliament where they could elect their own Mensheviks or communists or whatever. That was the preferable way to do it. They did not want a revolution. The Mensheviks would be happy with some peaceful reform with gradual progress within a legal framework. Not the Bolsheviks. Lenin and his people wanted to kill the Tsar and his family and establish a new government from scratch. Again, this is a massive oversimplification, but I'm trying to keep it as short as I can. So we'll leave it there for now. Trotsky, very early on, was more of a Menshevik than anything. But it was a very loose affiliation. He never strongly supported the Mensheviks. He was only slightly more sympathetic to some of their causes. He eventually breaks away, and by the time 1904 rolls around, he has created distance between him and any of these factions. He wrote articles denouncing and criticizing both sides. You see, Trotsky was just too idealistic. Just being a Marxist wasn't enough anymore. There were too many of them, and by not taking a stand early on, he kinda doomed himself in the future, because when the Bolsheviks win out, they're still gonna have this lingering suspicion of all the would-be Mensheviks, namely Trotsky and other Trotsky sympathizers, or as they'd come to be known shortly, Trotskyists. People who didn't really agree with the Bolshevik cause but joined because, well, the Bolsheviks won the Civil War. And after Trotsky split with Lenin, oh boy, Lenin had a lot of bad things to say about Trotsky. Swine, scoundrel, Judas. You remember, right? The disciple that betrayed Jesus and basically got him killed. But Trotsky didn't see it as a betrayal. He called for unity. He wanted all Marxists to unite, Bolshevik and Menshevik alike, in revolution against their common enemies, the bourgeoisie, the czar, the capitalists. But his idealism would get the best of him, because they would never unite. In fact, the Soviet Union had to use genocide to achieve ideological unity. And even then, there were quiet dissidents. And as you might expect, another thing to note about the whole revolutionary culture was that they looked to the only other semi-successful revolution that ever happened in Europe, the French Revolution. After all, it resulted in the rise of Napoleon, and the last thing the Russians wanted was a Russian Bonaparte. And which of the French revolutionaries took the most blame for the catastrophe? Maximilien Robespierre. It was the gravest insult to be compared to him, which is why it was such a big deal when Lenin was compared to Robespierre by Trotsky. You see, Maximilien Robespierre had been a particularly polarizing individual. I mean, listen to the following statement. I know only two parties, the party of good and the party of bad citizens. Trotsky identifies this as senseless intolerance, condemning and eventually killing comrades, people that would have otherwise been on your side had you not taken things to the extreme. It's really interesting that Trotsky made this observation about Lenin because not even Trotsky realized how right he was in the long run. But either way, his idealism put them in a bind. Trotsky would be spending quite a long time in ideological exile, as I like to call it. In his mind, he was standing with the revolutionary spirit, really living the way a true Marxist should. But the problem was that he was standing alone, and he was way too self-confident to ever question his own moral and ideological superiority. Just think about how sure of yourself you have to be to get a job at the #1 Marxist newspaper in the world, and you immediately start butting heads with guys who have dedicated their entire lives to this cause. I mean, Plekhanov, he's been doing this thing since before Trotsky was born. Pavel Axelrod had been a Marxist revolutionary for 2 decades, not to mention Lenin himself, and countless others that played major roles in making this revolution possible. Alexander Bogdanov, the co-leader of the émigré Bolshevik faction, wrote to Lenin's wife, quote, Trotsky came round to see me. I very much dislike him. He's totally uncongenial. And it's really funny when you start reading some of the memoirs and the letters and the notes, because oftentimes in history we like to see some kind of trend, especially when it comes to something as big as the Russian Revolution or communism. Like it just seems like it's one big united blob, and it really wasn't. It was made up of flawed individuals who sometimes didn't really like each other, sometimes they butted heads, sometimes they had ideological splits that literally cut the movement in half. Now, there are 2 important dates for the Russian Revolution. One of them is 1917, the year most people associate with the true start to the Soviet Socialist Republic. But the other year is 1905, the year that made 1917 possible. Marxists and agitators had been pushing for a revolution for decades now. But revolution takes time. There were humongous changes in 1905 that made 1917 possible in the first place. Let's start with how Trotsky changed everything. He had become really good at spreading Marxist propaganda, right? He'd been doing this propaganda thing for a really long time now. He spent all of those years in prison educating himself, and it really showed. His ideas were refined. His speeches were incredible. His words moved the audience and won over countless supporters. Quote, "In the Soviet, I operated under the name of Yanovsky after the village in which I was born. In the press, I wrote as Trotsky. I had to work for 3 newspapers. Together with Parvis, I headed the tiny Russian Gazette, turning it into a fighting organ for the masses. Within a few days, the circulation rose from 30,000 to 100,000. A month later, it had reached 500,000. But our technical resources could not keep up with the growth of the newspaper. We were finally delivered from this contradiction only by a government raid. On November 13th, in a block with the Mensheviks, we established a big political organ, the Beginning. The paper's circulation grew not day by day, but hour by hour. The Bolshevik new life without Lenin seemed rather drab. The Beginning, on the contrary, achieved gigantic success. And then came the moment that changed Russian history forever. January 9th, 1905. An Orthodox priest organizes a small, peaceful demonstration outside the Tsar's winter palace on a typical, cold, windy day. Snow covered the ground. White was in every direction. The people were hungry, but they were determined. Their only goal was to deliver a petition to the Tsar. Just a piece of paper. To let him know that life for the average person was becoming unbearable. They couldn't do it anymore. And they weren't asking for much either. They wanted slightly better working conditions, such as an 8-hour workday, an introduction of a national parliament, and limitations on the power of state officials, who were oftentimes corrupt as heck. In comparison to Western European nations of the day, this was not asking for very much at all. They just wanted some crumbs. The Western Europeans, they had parliaments, and they could vote, and they had some kind of power. They weren't even serfs for the most part. It was laughable in comparison. But the Tsar did not hear their demands. He wasn't even home. He didn't care. And then, the Tsar's men opened fire, killing hundreds of people. Estimates vary on casualty figures. According to the Tsars, there were 96 deaths and 333 injuries. Doesn't sound too horrible, but if you look at the anti-government sources, they were saying there were closer to 4,000 deaths. That's a big difference there, isn't it? Most credible historians would say there were probably about 1,000 killed and wounded. It's really difficult to say with any certainty because, well, both sides had such obvious motives and were both shameless enough to inflate numbers to their own advantage. The government wanted to downplay its own crimes, and the protesters wanted the public to unanimously support their cause for freedom. This did not end well for the government. Once word got out, the entire nation of Russia halted productivity. At one point, there are 750,000 railway workers on strike, completely shutting down the railways in most parts of the country, and thousands of other workers joined in too. 122 additional revolutions start going on in smaller towns and cities against the government. The Russian people, they were mad. This was a complete disaster. And oddly enough, it's a disaster that could have been avoided. In Trotsky's book, 1905, he talks about the government's complete ineptitude in dealing with the situation. They knew days in advance what was going to happen. Reporters had written stories about it across Europe. Quote, Every Paris concierge knew 3 days in advance that there was going to be a revolution in Petersburg on Sunday, January 9th, and the Russian government did not move a finger to avoid the massacre. Yikes, that sounds absolutely horrible. They knew it was coming and still fired into a crowd of unarmed protesters. Can't get any worse than that, can it? Oh, dear listener, but it can, because 2 days later, there was a meeting of the Committee of Ministers to make sense of what happened here. What was their excuse for not dealing with the revolution? Quote, Count Witt proposed that the events which had taken place on the 9th and the measures for the future prevention of such regrettable events be discussed. Witt's proposal was rejected as not falling within the committee's competence and not included in the agenda for the present meeting. It wasn't on the agenda. You heard that right. It wasn't on the agenda. The revolution may not have been on the Russian government's agenda, but it was on the Russian people's agenda. If salvation didn't come from above, revolution would come from below. The demonstrators got what they wanted. The Tsar caved. This led to the creation of the State Duma, where anyone could have the ability to vote for representatives in the government. I know that doesn't sound too enticing to us in the 21st century, but this was an enormous leap for the Russian people. They had the right to vote. They didn't get all of their demands met, but this was a big step in the right direction. It both excited and horrified the communist revolutionaries. On the one hand, they had made a lot of progress, but on the other, this might have satisfied people enough that this revolutionary movement lost all of its momentum. This was not enough for Trotsky. Quote, On October 18th, the day after the manifesto's publication, many tens of thousands of people were standing in front of St. Petersburg University, aroused by the struggle and intoxicated with the joy of their first victory. I shouted to them from the balcony that a half-victory was unreliable, that the enemy was irreconcilable, that there were traps ahead. I tore up the Imperial Manifesto and threw the pieces to the winds. Trotsky and the Marxists managed to create the very first Soviet, or Council of Workers, toward the end of 1905, and the Tsarist government, understanding the difficult position, doubled down on arresting revolutionaries, and it wasn't long before Trotsky was imprisoned again. And while he was in prison, they allowed his new significant other, Natalia, to visit him. As one might suspect, it wasn't long before she became pregnant, and he was going to be a father again, and with a different woman, and oddly enough, this is now the second time while he's in prison that he's having kids. Maybe there's something about being in a cell that does it for him, who knows? The important fact is that at least this second wife wasn't imprisoned as well, although they were not legally married. Now, in his book, 1905, he really doubled down on his philosophical idea of permanent revolution, that there should be non-stop revolution everywhere on Earth, until the Marxist utopia truly came about for every single human being that's alive. This idea is one of his most significant contributions to Marxist philosophy. It's something he's associated with even now after his own death. We're going to have to fast forward a few years here. Things are fairly uneventful. As is all too common with the communist revolutionary type, he escapes prison, and when he gets out, he continues spreading propaganda while living in exile. He spends a few years in a couple different places: London, Luxembourg, Paris, spends a few years as a war journalist in the Balkans. The year 1914. The Great War was about to envelop the continent. Cohesion was absolutely lost amongst the revolutionaries, completely gone. No one agreed on anything anymore. Trotsky argued for pacifism. Plekhanov advocated for Russia's victory. Lenin wanted Russia to lose. It was complete chaos. And out of all these little revolutionary events that took place in Russia, this was probably as organic as you get. There was not some kind of demonstrated effort by a bunch of leading Bolsheviks or anyone else. The years of World War I were miserable for the Russian people. The war took the lives of millions of Russian soldiers. The already backward economy plummeted. Everyone suffered. When the Russian people finally overthrew the Tsar, they did so without any organizational leadership. They didn't need it. The hatred they felt for the Tsarist regime was enough. There are even accounts of Russian citizens not minding a German invasion because, well, at least they might restore some order. Order didn't come though, not from the Germans, not from a provisional government, not from any of the elected party members. You see, transitioning from an absolute monarchy to a democratic government is always tough, especially when one of the most powerful factions of society are the Bolsheviks. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that this provisional government thing only lasted a few months. Trotsky is all over the place during World War I. It isn't very long that France deports him to Spain, from Spain to New York City. He tried going back to Europe, but his ship got intercepted by the British Navy and he was imprisoned in Nova Scotia, Canada. The Russian foreign minister, Pavel Milyukov, who was a moderate liberal, demanded Trotsky's freedom and return to Russia as a Russian citizen. After all, Russia was technically on the side of Britain and the entirety of the Anglosphere. Declining this request could have meant worse-off relations with Russia, and no one wanted to fight Germany alone, especially not when it was the Second Reich. Now, Trotsky was slowly building a stellar reputation as a Marxist thinker. A fellow communist said, quote, "Here's a great revolutionary who's arrived, and one gets the feeling that Lenin, however clever he may be, is starting to fade next to the genius of Trotsky." And that is really saying something. Lenin is basically the father of the revolutionaries at this point, and here he is getting shown up by Trotsky. There wasn't as much friction between the two of them as you might think, though. They were gradually beginning to have similar opinions on what had to be done. Trotsky had some Menshevik leanings in the early 1900s, but by this point, he's really starting to side with the Bolsheviks more and more, because he sees where the real power is. He even sounds like one of them at certain points. And of course, the big difference between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks is that the Bolsheviks were not afraid to embrace violence, an idea that Trotsky became much more receptive to by this point. Quote, "I tell you, heads must roll, blood must flow. The strength of the French Revolution was in the machine that made the enemies of the people shorter by a head. This is a fine device. We must have it in every city." Trotsky may not have started out as a Bolshevik, but words like this are the essence of Bolshevism. He was officially on board with the majority. The British diplomat to Russia, George Buchanan, witnessed so much of what happened during this horrible period that it's widely believed he wrote his memoir and left out a bunch of information. You couldn't have picked a more interesting time to be an ambassador to Russia. He started in 1910 and continued into 1917, when it was just too dangerous to stay anymore. He had a very good relationship with the Tsar and Tsarina, but as the situation in Russia came to a head, he broke diplomatic protocol and basically told the Tsar, "Listen, buddy, if you don't fix things, they're gonna overthrow you, and there's nothing anyone can do to stop it." Buchanan may have been out of line in his last meeting with the Tsar when he said, quote, "I can but plead as my excuse the fact that I have throughout been inspired by my feelings of devotion for your Majesty and the Empress. If I were to see a friend walking through a wood on a dark night along a path which I knew ended in a precipice, would it not be my duty, sir, to warn him of his danger? And is it not equally my duty to warn your Majesty of the abyss that lies ahead of you? You have, sir, come to the parting of the ways, and you have now to choose between two paths. The one will lead you to victory and a glorious peace. The other to revolution and disaster. Let me implore your Majesty to choose the former." Buchanan's words fell on deaf ears. The Tsar couldn't listen to his own advisors, let alone a foreign diplomat. And in early 1917, St. Petersburg erupted into an absolutely catastrophic conflict. This event went down in history as the February Revolution. Over 1,000 people died. The Tsar was forced to abdicate the throne. The empire was brought to an end, and the provisional government was installed. I do feel the need to point out this event happened in March for us, but Russia was still using a weird month system, the Julian calendar. I'm just going to call these events what they were called by the Soviet historians, cause it's like that for all of these events. Unfortunately for Trotsky, he was not in Russia during the February Revolution. He was back in New York. It's almost ironic. Someone that's this much of an idealistic Marxist living in the mecca of capitalism. You can just imagine how he responded to the lifestyle there. Trotsky was up to his neck in work, but his children really liked New York, more so than all of the European cities that they had stayed in. Before he left, he held a meeting at a casino and asked of the socialist New Yorkers, quote, "I want you people to organize and keep on organizing until you're able to overthrow this damned, rotten, capitalistic government of this country." It's funny too. It almost sounds like something one of his political enemies would paraphrase. No, these were his actual words. You don't even have to exaggerate what this guy says. And that's when we get into the real game changer, the October Revolution. The communists declared power over all of Russia, and this is the point in the story that the Russian people, who have already been suffering long, cold, hard, miserable years during World War I, facing a disastrous defeat, starvation, economic ruin, multiple revolutions, and changes of government, now they have to face the bloodshed of Bolshevism. Previous sympathizers grew cautious as the country fell apart around them. Theft, robbery, and murder became commonplace and wreaked havoc on the Russian people. Buchanan saw firsthand what was going on. Quote, "The government is now in the hands of a small clique of extremists who are bent on imposing their will on the country by terroristic methods." An American observer who worked in the embassy described it as a bunch of crazy people killing each other like we swat flies back home. And Trotsky shared responsibility for this chaos. He played an important role in developing a government that did just these things. That genocided people and imprisoned innocent civilians because they might pose a threat to their power. And Trotsky gets to be made out like he's some kind of victim in the whole story, which he's not. Just because you lost in the end does not take away all of the thousands of people you ordered to be slaughtered like animals. In fact, he not only exterminated his enemies, but he wanted to do away with all mercy toward his enemies at all. Quote, "We must put an end once and for all to the papist quacker babble about the sanctity of human life." Because to him, human life was not sacred. And it wasn't just genocide for being perceived as a potential traitor of the Soviet Union. Minor offenses could mean extremely harsh punishments. Trotsky called for grain hoarders to serve 10 years of hard labor. And all it took to be considered a grain hoarder was having a little bit. Even if you had a family to take care of, they came second to the revolution. And on top of that, if you had served in the military during the Tsarist regime, even if you were drafted against your will, you had questionable loyalties to the working class. This meant that you were still required to fight in the military, but now the USSR just took your family members hostage in case you did something you weren't supposed to. How's that for liberation? As the Red Army was ravaging most of Eastern Europe, he even encouraged war crimes. He wrote to a commanding officer in the Red Army that he should, quote, "take military measures, i.e., try to punish Latvia and Estonia in a military fashion. For example, by crossing over the frontier somewhere by half a mile and hanging between 100 and 1,000 of their bureaucrats and wealthy people. No due process, no justice for those innocent people. Now, one of Trotsky's first big jobs in the Soviet Union was acting as Commissar for Foreign Affairs, and he played a key role in a really important negotiation between Russia and the Central Powers. You may have heard of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, named after the city in Belarus where the negotiations took place. It was a humiliating defeat for the Russians and the newly established Soviet Union. After spending months and months negotiating, he resigned to not have to sign it. That's how bad the conditions were. He didn't want his name on it. Lenin called it an obscene peace, and it really was. Because Russia had to worry about the civil war with the White Army and other anti-communist groups, so they were completely at the mercy of the German Empire. The Civil War was a more pressing matter, so that's where the communists focused their effort, even if they had to concede a lot of territory to a capitalist imperial enemy. And during the Civil War of 1918, Trotsky sent a telegram to Lenin insisting that Stalin should be removed from power. And it's so fascinating how so early on, Stalin was identified as a bad guy. They didn't stop him though. Despite both Trotsky and Lenin and a few other leading Bolsheviks not really caring for Stalin, he stays in power. No one ever gets rid of him because he was the ultimate bureaucrat. He wasn't good at military strategy or persuasive speaking or writing or anything else. He was just the ultimate winner at office politics. And in most scenarios, that doesn't really matter, does it? But it does when that office has absolute authority over 100 million people. Stalin was a secondary issue though, because Lenin was shot in 1918. This unleashed a massive genie, one that could not easily be put back into the bottle. The Red Terror. The next year or so was defined by brutal tactics by communists. They did finally get rid of that papist quacker babble about the sanctity of human life. And oh, how the Russian people wept. The reason Trotsky has such a good reputation in the Western world is because he went out of his way to give favorable treatment to Western journalists. This is why, even today, so many Western leftists praise Leon Trotsky. At the time, even well-respected writers and intellectuals became sympathizers and enthusiastic about the Soviet Union. They thought, maybe this really could be the start of something new, a true utopian society. If it lived up to the ideals, maybe it really could have been. But the problem is that it fell short on every single ideal. So when thinkers like H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell visited the Soviet Union to see what was going on, they were mortified. So it didn't really matter how nice Trotsky was to any of these guys. Pleasantry can't hide oppression. Russell once said of Trotsky that he had the vanity of an actor, and I think that's one of those observations that really hits the nail on the head. Trotsky was dramatic. This might even be an understatement. It's people like Trotsky that made the Russian Revolution possible to begin with. Because what he and people like him did was present such a hyper-sensationalized view of the world that if you believed what you were reading or hearing, you had to become a sympathizer. And this is something that's a characteristic of many extremists, but I think Trotsky does it better than most. But as dramatic and galvanizing as he was to the masses, he never deluded himself behind closed doors. He knew what was going on. There was this Hungarian communist, right, György Lukács, who wrote a pamphlet that basically said the Soviet Union went from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom. You would think most communists would accept this idea, hopefully even agree considering they had just declared a Soviet state and secured power. But Trotsky, embittered by the reality of the situation, wrote some years later, quote, "I remember how Lenin and I laughed on this account and left with some bitterness, since the realm of freedom was ruled by famine and typhus." Not even the communist leadership believed they'd brought the socialist utopia to reality. The Poles have had a rough break throughout history.
their country always seems to be occupied by Russia or Germany or both. Generations of brave Polish people fought for their independence, and in 1919, they saw a potential opportunity arise. Europe had still not recovered from the catastrophe of World War I. Russia was a communist state. Germany was in ruins, and nobody really knew what was going to happen. We have the benefit of studying it with all the facts, and we know exactly how everything happens, and even focusing on tiny little Poland and its independence is a complex story with different movements and political figures and agreements and disagreements and everything else. The Polish rose up against Russian expansionism and, in a surprise to many, managed to hold their own against the Soviet forces. This event's known as the Polish-Soviet War, and it was a shock to many across the world. Poland was able to fight with a big country like the Soviet Union. And who was in charge of the Red Army during this conflict? Trotsky. Now, that's not to take away from his military expertise. The Soviets were still dealing with the Russian Civil War, so the number of military personnel they could actually put into this conflict was extremely low. And it's really important because it underscores a couple really interesting facts about this time period. Number one, the Red Army was a complete joke. They couldn't even beat Poland. They may have been fighting another front in the Russian Civil War, but it still goes to show that Poland could really hold its own against the USSR. In fact, it won't be the only small country that can. Shout out to you, Finland. Important point number two, Russia faces yet another humiliation on the world stage. Russia's just been losing ever since the Russo-Japanese War. World War I wasn't too terrible considering the Allies eventually pulled through and gave Russia some favorable treatment, but it's not like Russia really got to reap the rewards of a conflict other nations won. A lot of the things that Russia ceded to the Central Powers in the Brest-Litovsk Treaty were eventually given back to Russia. But even then, Russia still lost millions of people. They sacrificed more than any of the other allies during World War I, and all they did was not lose anything too big. Russia still wanted to keep Poland. And that's all gonna come to a head in the next World War. I don't think you can emphasize enough how much suffering the Eastern Europeans were experiencing during this time period. So first you had World War I, then you also had all of the horrors of communism, you have the Polish-Soviet War, you got this Russian Civil War. The Russian people in particular have just been suffering, and it's just conflict after conflict and horror and atrocity, and you just can't get your head around how bad it really was. All the things that made Russia a tough place to live before are now even worse. There's even less food. The economy is completely destroyed and can't be rebuilt because of communism, and the population suffered a tremendous loss during all of these conflicts. Thousands and millions of Russians had died and are dying now. It wasn't long into communist leadership that one big problem occurred. There wasn't enough food. People were starving, and this was a problem that the Russian Empire regularly faced. But now, with all these other problems and the communist leadership, it's infinitely worse. Thankfully, at least a few Bolsheviks were honest enough to notice, oh hey, there isn't enough food. This reaction spawned the New Economic Policy, abbreviated as the NEP. And the irony of the whole thing is that the NEP was a step toward capitalism. The whole thing the NEP embraced was free market capitalism. It wanted small farmers to go into the market and trade goods. That was the basis of the whole thing. And it's important because it's a complete reversal of all of communist thought. Now, of course, it wasn't complete free market capitalism. It was subject to state control and interference from time to time. But at a fundamental level, it was a step toward capitalism. Because even the idealists and dreamers like Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin and all these other Bolsheviks, even they could acknowledge that things were not working on the ground. The free market will create abundance if you give it enough time. But that's just the problem. The famine is now. It's going to take some time before the peasantry can grow enough food to survive, let alone create a surplus. And that's when the Soviet government makes one of many decisions that are truly despicable. Possibly one of the most unethical things that ever happened during the Soviet regime, at least in my humble opinion. They redistributed food from rural peasants, the people who grew the food. They took that food from those people and gave it to all the working class in the cities. The Soviets weren't stupid. They knew where the real political power was and where it wasn't. It was in the cities, the capital, the major population centers. It was not on some rural farm in the middle of nowhere. So, they took the food from these impoverished peasants and gave it to their loyal communist supporters in the city. And on the surface, it looks like everything was okay. If you were in a city, that is. This is why you even have some American and British journalists go over there and write wonderful things. If you're in the city, well, everyone looks well fed and has more than enough, and yeah, maybe it seemed like a decent place to live, but the Soviet leadership picked specific cities and locations for these journalists to go. And you see, that's the problem. These writers didn't see the mass starvation on the farms and rural areas or even other parts of the city. They only saw what the communists wanted them to see. And sometimes you even had cases where a journalist, for whatever ideological reasons, a lot of times they were sympathizers, they went out of their way to ignore the crimes and atrocities going on in Russia. There was way too much of that going on, which is so horribly dishonest that you can't help but to feel some kind of bitterness about that. People like Walter Duranty are a really good example of this. He went over to Russia, wrote all of these articles and everything else back in America in English saying, oh yeah, things are great here, it's this great egalitarian society, women are freed, the working class is liberated from the oppression of capitalism. But it was all just a lie. The famine was horrible. Someone needed to get help. And despite the Bolsheviks' attempt at suppressing knowledge of the famine, word got out. So much so that American relief missions were going over to feed these starving people. One of the guys who played a big role was actually Herbert Hoover, who later became the President of the United States. Say what you will about Hoover, but he wanted to alleviate the suffering of these innocent people. And Trotsky denounced him, called him an accursed enemy. He really didn't like accepting help from anyone that wasn't a fellow Bolshevik. Trotsky wrote, quote, "Here we need to remember that we are not Hungary, we are not a young Soviet republic, we have our own special organs, we have the Cheka. The Cheka isn't loved, but then again, we don't love the counter-revolution." And that's why it's always important to remember what separates people like us from people like Leon Trotsky. Our willingness to question our own ideas and hold on to our ethical principles. When you're willing to prevent relief efforts from helping starving people just to spite your ideological enemies, you have lost any moral high ground. I don't care if you're left, right, or something else. This kind of behavior is not acceptable for anyone under any circumstances, and it's really sad that someone with this kind of behavior became all too common in the Soviet Union. March 6th, 1923. A very important day for Russia. Their communist founding father, Vladimir Lenin, became deathly ill, and on this day, he had a stroke. He lost his ability to speak. He never really recovered from this one and was never politically active again. There were only so many people who could fill his shoes, and the trickiest part about replacing him was that he held no official title. You would think that he would have been like the communist president or something, but no, he was literally just one of many organizational leaders that held no official title. The reason he was considered to be the de facto leader at all was because so many party members trusted and followed him. Lenin's replacement could have been anyone, but there were a couple of figures who really stood out. Stalin, Trotsky, and the other old Bolsheviks. Stalin outmaneuvered them all. He was ruthless in his bid for power, and one by one, isolated, exiled, and executed anyone that stood in the way. And it was really interesting the way it happened. So, right after Lenin's death in 1922, 3 leading Bolshevik members form a small leadership organization. They call it a troika, and if you're familiar with the Roman triumvirate, that's kind of what it was based on. 3 leaders who had control of everything. And it's really interesting too because they had the foresight of knowing what happened during the Roman triumvirate, where Caesar basically took complete control and killed the other 2 members, yet still try to replicate this model for some reason. This troika was made up of 3 leading Bolsheviks: Kamenev, Zinoviev, and Stalin. This was kind of a play on the whole idea of, well, I'm just a humble Soviet politician, and I know I can't replace Vladimir Lenin, so maybe the 3 of us can at least try to fill his shoes. Of course, it was just party politicking. At least one of them was already planning to take all the power they could, and that's just the one that we know about. The other 2 may very well have been plotting the same thing, but just weren't as smart. And after Lenin put capitalism back into place under the new economic policy, there was a serious disagreement over how long it should be allowed to continue. Trotsky was a leading member of what became known as the left opposition. They basically believed that the capitalist elements of the Soviet economy should be destroyed and they needed to just focus on faster industrialization. And then there were the people who supported the NEP within the party, and it was a majority of the party, including the Troika. So, the new economic policy had the backing of Lenin, the current leadership in the Troika, most people, and a lot of ordinary folks too, not even, non-political entities. And this was the only major disagreement going on during this time. Trotsky argued that you can't have a socialist utopia without world revolution. According to him, there was never going to be a peaceful and prosperous Soviet Union unless the entire world joined the cause of socialism. And Stalin vehemently disagreed. Stalin formed the idea of socialism in one country. It basically boils down to, let's just consolidate power here before we worry about anywhere else. And this brings us to the big ideological difference between Stalin and Trotsky. Because he wanted to stand true to the principles of Marxism. It wasn't about securing power for himself or even the Soviet government. He wanted to liberate the working class of the entire earth, not just Russia. Stalin was very different though. It's hard to believe that he even cared about ideology at all. Stalin wanted to secure power for himself. If some day laborer on the other side of the planet continues to be exploited by capitalist overlords, well, it didn't really matter to him. That wasn't going to diminish his power in any significant way. And the interesting thing was that the other 2 members of the Troika disagreed with Stalin on this issue. They thought international Marxism was the only way to go. And as early as 1924, Stalin starts hurling accusations about these other 2. The second you started having disagreements with Joseph Stalin, your reputation was in the crosshairs. And as shaky as the Troika was, it could unite against one common enemy: Trotsky. Because in 1924, he published Lessons of October, which was basically a summary of the events of the 1917 revolution. Other Bolsheviks had a lot of criticisms, but here are the 3 big ones. Number 1, Trotsky didn't really talk about his disagreements with Lenin and the Bolsheviks prior to 1917. He just completely forgets about him. Remember, it was only that year that he became a Bolshevik. Number 2, they allege that he distorted the events of 1917 in order to emphasize his own role and downplay everyone else. Number 3, Trotsky left out his harsh treatment of subordinates and any mistakes he made during the Russian Civil War, and trust me, there were many. Everyone is a little biased when they say something or write something, but this is so true for Trotsky. Everything he wrote was taken to the extreme and steeped in his own self-certainty. He was so sure about everything that he ever said or thought or wrote that he just never questioned any of his own ideas. And a lot of the Soviet leadership noticed that this could have been Trotsky's attempt at trying to make himself into the next Vladimir Lenin. Everyone was paranoid about this. And remember, the revolutionaries didn't want to create another Napoleon Bonaparte. And remember, Trotsky was in charge of the Red Army in differing capacities at different times. Many regarded him as one of the smartest thinkers in the Soviet Union. So ideologically and intellectually, he was up there with Lenin. He also had a lot of respect and an understanding of the Red Army. And then he puts out something like Lessons of October, and all of a sudden, the suspicions and the paranoia of the other leading Bolsheviks really seem to be coming true. Personally, I don't think this was Trotsky's bid for power. I don't think he was consciously doing it. I think he just did what he thought should have been done. And that inevitably appeared to be this vying for power that everyone was so worried about. So Lessons of October gets published, and there is a Soviet smear campaign of Trotsky's name. And here's the worst part. He got sick not too long after publishing Lessons of October, so when everyone starts coming out and attacking him, he can't really defend himself. And the media frenzy almost completely destroys his reputation. It was a big blow. This was the first domino in Trotsky's political undoing. Very soon, copies of Lessons of October began disappearing from the public, and anyone reading it or discussing it was treated with suspicion. They dragged out everything they could to smear Trotsky's name, including using letters from the Tsarist police. Anything they could do to show the people that Trotsky had a lot of disagreements with Lenin, and oh, what do you know, he really wasn't one of us all along. The smear campaign forced Trotsky to resign in his leading role in the Red Army. He almost got expelled from the party overall. It was Stalin who refused to go along with kicking Trotsky out. You see, Stalin was against Trotsky. He didn't like him. But whenever someone is in this weakened political position, it's better to just keep them around. It was strategic thinking because now Trotsky's still here. His reputation is severely damaged. Trotsky never really recovers from this within the Soviet Union. So whenever Stalin wants to in the future, he can just ramp up the propaganda against Trotsky again, turn to all this older stuff, and Trotsky's gonna be done. So Trotsky's career is basically over whenever Stalin wants it to be. But of course, Stalin tries playing it off like he was the moderate and he was trying to give Trotsky the benefit of the doubt. But really, he was just keeping him around so he could get rid of him once and for all when it was convenient for him. And it's so crazy because Trotsky misjudged Stalin so hard. There was one point when someone asked Trotsky what he thought of Stalin, and Trotsky replied, quote, "The greatest mediocrity in our party." I would just love to see the look on Trotsky's face when he realized the greatest mediocrity in the party became the supreme leader in a few short years. And the really sinister part of the Bolshevik leadership is how they created this fake ideology. They created Trotskyism. Trotsky was not trying to start some kind of movement. He simply had his own perspective on things and voiced his opinion. But the Bolsheviks, especially the Troika, turned Trotskyism into a subversive menace within the party. And they made it look like Trotsky was behind it all. Now, Trotsky came to his senses and accepted the situation for what it was. After losing his job, he was unemployed in 1925, and without any income, he realized he needed to bite the bullet here. He accepted a few lesser positions in the government and realigned himself with the Troika. After kowtowing, Zinoviev straight up said to him, quote, "If you had not written the Lessons of October, we should have found some other pretext. We had to tie in the old disagreements with current ones. After all, it was we who created Trotskyism." Trotsky may have been outplayed in the short term, but he still had a few tricks up his sleeve. He managed to win over a bunch of supporters to his opposition group, which didn't have an official name, but became known as the United Opposition. Not only did he win over everyone who had a bone to pick with Stalin and his horrible policies, but he even won over the other two members of the Troika, and things only escalated from there. Stalin went from secretly dealing with the opposition behind closed doors to overtly harassing them, expelling them from the party, even arresting some of them. And one of the big points of contention was the Chinese question, because China, very similarly to Russia, had recently overthrown their imperial government. China had a little bit of a head start though. They overthrew their government, oddly enough, in October of 1911, same month. I guess October's the month for revolution. There were a bunch of different factions in China, and the Soviet Union needed an ally, because every single revolution in Western Europe failed, and failed bad. So creating an ally to the East, especially with a powerful nation like China, was really going to be a strategic move. No one needed allies more than the Soviet Union. Think about how stressful it would have been to have been a member in this government. So, you're someone who's an ideological supporter of Marxism. You finally have the first revolution in history to be successful and establish communism, and here you are, the only country to successfully put Marx's ideas into practice. And you constantly have to worry about being invaded and just having some other country come in and take you out of power. If Britain and France formed a coalition and decided, hey, we don't want communism to exist anywhere on Earth, they very easily could have done that. They just didn't. So China was so important. The Chinese situation is a really complex topic, but long story short, Stalin wanted to support anyone that was against the Chinese Empire. That included Republicans and nationalists, but Trotsky only wanted to support fellow communists. And this becomes all too common a theme between pragmatic Stalin and ideological Trotsky. Trotsky ended up being right though, because China's right-wing organization had a lot of anti-communists amongst their ranks. And in 1927 they committed a massacre in Shanghai, leaving hundreds of Chinese communists dead. This was a giant setback for internationalism and left many Soviets in Russia feeling completely demoralized. After Stalin was proven to be so wrong, his attacks against the United Opposition got even worse. Stalin never let up on these attacks. He finally succeeded in his ultimate goal in October of 1927, when Trotsky and Zinoviev were expelled from the Central Committee. Anyone who had voiced sympathy for these men at any point in time were later targeted themselves. The 15th Party Congress officially declared that anyone who held United Opposition views could not be part of the Communist Party. Quite a few people capitulated and simply renounced any sympathy they previously had. But Trotsky and a few others stayed the course. This may not have been the best course of action. You see, 1927 was a particularly bad year for the newly formed Soviet state because Stalin used the excuse of an alleged coup to pass a new set of laws that really cemented his power of position. Keep in mind, these laws were secret. Only Stalin and the Politburo knew of their existence, which is particularly scary because one of these laws reads in part, quote, "Persons propagating opposition views be regarded as dangerous accomplices of the external and internal enemies of the Soviet Union, and that such persons be sentenced as spies by administrative decree." Basically, anyone who disagreed with Stalin was an enemy of the state. Trotsky was too sure of himself to give up on his views though, and if you look at it, he was more aligned with Marx's ideal than Stalin ever was. But being more ideologically pure is not going to stop the wrath of Joseph Stalin. The only thing that saved Trotsky was Stalin's fear of ruining the good name of the Soviet Union. Stalin wanted Trotsky out, but if he outright killed him, there was going to be shockwaves throughout the world. Socialist sympathizers were going to become anti-communist, and people who were already against communism were going to use this as another piece of propaganda against the Soviet Union. Instead of outright killing him, Stalin organized a position that Trotsky
was going to be forced to take. This new position was in Kazakhstan, very far away from any political power. Of course, he tried to refuse, but Stalin had the power of the bureaucracy behind his will. Trotsky was going to have to go. And the fascinating thing about it too was that the ordinary Russian people supported Trotsky. They saw what was going on. They didn't want him heading off to some random city where he wasn't going to be able to do anything. So on the day he was set to leave, Russian workers from all over the country swarmed the railway station and blocked the line. The Soviet military didn't even intervene because they were scared of repeating the Tsar's mistakes. So they just let it happen. It didn't really stop anything though, they only delayed Trotsky's departure by 2 measly days. But it's the thought that counts. This begins the next phase of Trotsky's life, and there were 2 big things that changed. The first is that he is significantly less productive and never really does anything for the rest of his life, at least anything of significance. He writes a lot in exile, but he's never in a direct position of power to do anything ever again. The second big change is that he's always on the run. When the Soviet Union is after you, it does not matter how far you run or how well you hide, they will find you, eventually. The next couple years were miserable. There wasn't a whole lot he could do. He spent some time in Turkey, which was especially dangerous because a lot of the Russians who fought for the White Army during the Civil War fled, and they happened to land in Turkey. You can bet that there were plenty of Russian monarchists and right-wingers who would have just loved to get their hands on the dreaded Leon Trotsky, who led the Red Army during the Civil War and condoned a lot of the war crimes that happened. He understood Turkey just wasn't a safe country to stay in. Trotsky received asylum from France. He was lucky enough that their prime minister at the time just happened to be a radical socialist. But France didn't work out very well because, you see, France got a little too close to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union didn't want Trotsky to try to get anywhere near any position of power. So France had a diplomatic agreement with the Soviet Union, and one of those clauses was that Trotsky wasn't going to be able to stay there. He applied for asylum in Norway, lived there for about a year. The next major event for Trotsky was the 1936 Soviet show trials. This was a very big deal because the term the Soviet state used was Trotskyist Zinovьevist plot. His name is part of the show trial. And then there were the other 2 members of the Troika, Zinoviev and Kamenev. Yeah, they were both killed during this show trial. And it's really interesting because Trotsky and his family were ordered to live on a small farm in Norway. It was an even smaller area with a more rural population, and they were basically under house arrest. For 22 hours a day, they weren't allowed to leave the house, and during those 2 hours, they were only allowed to walk around on the farm. That was it. It was some pretty rough treatment, especially because he didn't get to communicate with the outside world. This Moscow show trial changed everything for socialist politics and history, and Trotsky wasn't able to voice his criticism of it. The government you spent your entire life to create was now killing some of its founding members based on a lie and ruining the good name of communism. Not to mention the fact that he wasn't just in exile now, the Soviet government was after him. Every single person was found guilty and sentenced to death at this show trial, including Trotsky himself. This was horrible, and it was made all the more painful by the fact he couldn't respond to any of it. And just think about it for a minute, he wasn't even present at his own show trial where he was sentenced to death. He reflected on his time in Norway, writing, quote, "When I look back today on this period of internment, I must say that never, anywhere in the course of my entire life, and I have lived through many things, was I persecuted with as much miserable cynicism as I was by the Norwegian socialist government. For 4 months, these ministers, dripping with democratic hypocrisy, gripped me in a stranglehold to prevent me from protesting the greatest crime history may ever know." He got deported from Norway a few months later anyway. He made his way to Mexico. He was welcomed by the Mexican president and stayed in Mexico City. While he was in exile, there was one thing that he could do that was right. And oh boy, did he write. He wrote some of his most famous works, including The Revolution Betrayed and History of the Russian Revolution, both of which will be covered in detail on YouTube and Biocast Addendum if you want to watch or listen to it there. There's a lot of good information to be covered, and if you have to listen to it in the car or while you go for a walk, you can listen to the Biocast Addendum episode. I personally think it's better to watch the video on YouTube because there's a presentation that goes along with it, and I think that makes it a little easier to understand. But really, it's whatever works for you. So make sure to check both of those out if you want more information on Trotsky and his writings. Outside of his writing, though, not very much was accomplished. He did the best he could to spread the word about Stalin and the corrupt Soviet regime, but it didn't change anything. Socialist sympathizers continued to defend the USSR. Now, this is not to say that Trotsky had no supporters. He had quite a few. He was, at one time, the most popular Marxist in the world other than Lenin and Stalin. But at this point, he was just some old guy with an accent who was living in exile. And he was trying to compete with an entire nation state with thousands of bureaucrats and propagandists. I mean, every single thing Trotsky did from here on out was challenged by the Soviet Union. There was one point where he traveled to the US to appear as a witness in a committee for the House of Representatives. And there was all this propaganda that got pushed out by the Soviet Union, accusing him of being on the payroll of oil magnates and the FBI. There was no winning for him at this point. Even when he started the Fourth International, it just couldn't compete with the power and the prestige of Stalin's Comintern. There seemed to be no hope. Not just for Trotsky, but for true communism in general. He still believed that the socialist utopia would come about one day. Quote, "In addition to the happiness of being a fighter for the cause of socialism, fate gave me the happiness of being her husband. During the almost 40 years of our life together, she remained an inexhaustible source of love, magnanimity, and tenderness. She underwent great sufferings, especially in the last period of our lives. But I find some comfort in the fact that she also knew days of happiness. For 43 years of my conscious life, I have remained a revolutionist. For 42 of them, I have fought under the banner of Marxism. If I had to begin all over again, I would of course try to avoid this or that mistake, but the main course of my life would remain unchanged. I shall die a proletarian revolutionist, a Marxist, a dialectical materialist, and consequently an irreconcilable atheist. My faith in the communist future of mankind is not less ardent, indeed it is firmer today than it was in the days of my youth. Natasha has just come up to the window from the courtyard and opened it wider so that the air may enter more freely into my room. I can see the bright green strip of grass beneath the wall and the clear blue sky above the wall and sunlight everywhere. Life is beautiful. Let the future generations cleanse it of all evil, oppression, and violence and enjoy it to the full." On August 20th, 1940, Trotsky was attacked by Ramon Mercader, a Mexican NKVD agent. The attack was brutal. Trotsky was hit in the head with an ice axe. It didn't kill him instantly. He even survived for an entire day. But he lost too much blood. He was in shock. And on August 21st, he became one of the millions of Stalin's victims. Someone who had spent his entire life fighting for communism, only to have the first communist government in existence assassinate him. The ultimate irony. Trotsky was a dreamer, but he was dreaming the wrong dream. His dream was a nightmare not just for himself, but for the millions who perished under the horrors of communism. Let his life stand as a reminder, and not as a reminder of the evils of communism because we know those all too well. No, let Trotsky stand as a reminder that no matter how certain you may be, you still might be wrong. And that was the life of Leon Trotsky. Thank you so much for listening all the way through. I really hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. So I have this problem, right? Whenever I listen to a really good podcast episode, I'm kind of sad when it ends. It kind of feels like right when I was starting to get into it, the episode ends and that's it. If you have that feeling right now, boy, do I have good news for you. When I was researching this episode, I realized something very quickly. There was going to be way too much to talk about in the Biocast episode alone. So what I did was I took a lot of these interesting little tidbits here and there, and I just combined them all into one big Postscript episode. There are topics like how Trotsky is viewed in Russia today, Trotsky and Lenin's friendship, exactly why Trotsky lost to Stalin, and a whole bunch more. So let me tell you the 2 ways you can get access to this Leon Trotsky Postscript episode. Option number 1, check it out over on gumroad.com/biocast. For the price of a cup of coffee, you can get another hour's worth of podcast audio on Leon Trotsky. If you're not a memorize the URL kind of person, there will be a link in the show notes. Now let me tell you about the second option, which I personally think is a lot better. Starting at just $2 a month, you can get access to the Leon Trotsky Postscript episode and every other Postscript episode in existence. You can become a Biocast bonus member on Patreon by visiting patreon.com/biocast. And again, there will be a link in the description if you're just that kind of person. Thank you so much. My name is Michael McCauley. This is Biocast, and I will see you in the next one. Peace out.